The history of the use of climate weapons begins in the United States, with an interesting situation surrounded by mysticism and little-known facts. The only confirmed case of the use of climate weapons in the war is associated with the events in Vietnam, and came true thanks to the terrain and the actions of the troops of North Vietnam. With the U.S. already in control of southern Vietnam, the country became divided, and the Americans sought to expand their control over the border areas in Laos and Cambodia, where the guerrillas used thick trees as cover and successfully shipped weapons along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It became vital for the U.S. to stop this flow of weapons and destroy the trail. But it was very difficult because of the danger to U.S. troops fighting in unfamiliar terrain. Thus, Operation Popeye was developed, in which, from March 20, 1967, American C-130 transport aircraft and F-45 fighters released special substances into the atmosphere that caused intense downpours over Laos. Although it initially seemed that victory was close and the Ho Chi Minh Trail would be destroyed, the Viet Cong's resistance was so persistent that they came up with new supply routes. Despite the significant cost of 5.5 tons of silver iodide and millions of dollars in fines, the Americans did not manage to completely disrupt the supply along the trail. In response to such events, the UN passed a resolution in 1977 banning the use of climate weapons and listing them as potential weapons of mass destruction. However, this did not stop countries, including the USSR, from possibly getting involved in climate impact research long before such ideas became mainstream. For example, back in the 1950s, a monumental station was installed in the USSR to study the ionosphere, mainly for the scientific purpose of understanding natural climatic processes. In fact, the ionosphere is a complex part of the Earth's atmosphere, located at altitudes from 50 to 1,000 kilometers. It is saturated with charged particles of natural origin and performs several important functions. First, it serves as protection from the solar wind. Secondly, the ionosphere is able to reflect and scatter radio waves, and indirectly affects the movement of air in the atmosphere. It is clear that manipulations with the ionosphere are of promising interest for military purposes. These capabilities range from being able to block radio communications from an enemy to creating artificial turbulence capable of causing destructive winds in the desired area. It should be noted that all this at the moment remains an exclusively theoretical study. However, in the past, the USSR built a huge station Sorai in Zmyhov, which conducted test experiments on the impact on the ionosphere using radio waves, including the creation of artificial turbulence and the impact on plasma. The US has also developed its own version with similar goals, called HARP. Both of these stations are still the subject of conspiracy theories, and their supporters like to point out that Russia did not cut funding for the Sur station, even during the difficult times of the 1990s, while the United States, despite the 2008 economic crisis, stopped funding HARP. It is pointless to assume a military orientation of such projects, but on the other hand, it is worth noting that the funding for HARP was closed in 2013, and now the station is no longer active. As such, it's safe to say that conspiracy theories involving the use of climate weapons to prepare for war with the Jovian Jedi aren't supported. In fact, the situation with climate weapons projects is more interesting in the civilian sphere. The UN prohibits the use of climate weapons for military purposes, but the USSR decided to use this principle for a purely scientific project, the construction of the largest dam on the planet. The idea was simple: to build an 86-kilometer dam that would completely block the Bering Strait separating Alaska and the USSR. It was one of the longest dams at that time, and the Fort Peck Dam in the United States, which was one of the longest at that time, was much shorter than the intended dam. Pyotr Mikhailovich Borisov demonstrated a real Soviet genius by presenting a fully workable project for such a structure. The main purpose of the dam was to seal off the Arctic Ocean, melting its glaciers and making the northern parts of the USSR, including Siberia, a warm paradise on Earth. At first glance, the idea seems crazy, but in fact it is backed up by historical evidence. In the past, Antarctica was connected to Australia by a small isthmus, and this led to the fact that palm trees grew on the territory of Antarctica, and dinosaurs lived on the Earth. Their remains are found in areas that are now not covered with ice. Modern models also indicate that such an idea has a historical basis. The USSR had its own arguments, and in our time, one of the factors that ensure good weather in Europe is the warm Gulf Stream. Its functioning is due to the fact that warm water partially pushes out the cool water of the Arctic Ocean, flowing through the Bering Strait. As the Gulf Stream and other warm currents reach Chukotka and other coastal areas of the Far East, they become too cold, and the climate in these parts of the Earth remains cold. The idea of blocking the strait and forcing the Gulf Stream to sail along Chukotka in the Far East in order to grow fruit in Yakutia sounds very funny and, at first glance, may seem unrealistic. However, in fact, this idea has a certain meaning. In 1960, the U.S. scientific community published a message to Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, asking them to consider the possibility of American participation in such a project. A similar logic caught the attention of Canadian scientists, who also presented the idea of building a dam. Together with the Far East, even Alaska and the Northern Territories of Canada could turn into tropical zones. An even more exciting proposal was the use of a whole cascade of nuclear power plants in the USSR to power pumps pumping water from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific, then to the Current and to the Indian Oceans. This would reduce the water level in the Arctic by 10 meters per year, and the glaciers could melt over time. Many, of course, are wondering, what would happen to the territories from which they plan to take the Gulf Stream? This question is quite reasonable, since modern calculations show that such a dam would lead to radical changes in the climate of various regions. Japan and the Polynesian islands would turn into tundra, and Europe would freeze over, with its famous California beaches turned into winter resorts. If we talk about the USSR, then its territories would also not have done without serious changes. Crimea would have gone underwater, the Krasnodar territory would have become a drifting snow, and in Yakutia a swamp would have blossomed instead of bananas. In addition, the channels of the Great Siberian rivers would freeze, and a small sea would form on the continent. We have already talked about the funny story of the formation of Lake Shagan as a result of a thermonuclear explosion. But there is another lake with an extremely symbolic name, Nuclear. This lake was created as part of the Taiga project, which is as bold as the dam idea. It all started in 1971, when Soviet scientists were worried about the loss of water from the Caspian Sea. The solution was clear: to blow up 250 atomic bombs. This is not a joke, but a real description of the Taiga project. The aim of the project was to change the channels of the Pechora and Kalva rivers in the Perm region from the Caspian Sea. Although it was far enough, technically everything was correctly calculated, since the continental divide is located in this area, which could affect the global balance of power between the Caspian Sea and the Arctic Ocean, so that the former takes more water for itself. On March 23, 1971, the first 3 nuclear charges were detonated as part of the project, each equal in power to the explosions in Hiroshima, but much more effective. People felt tremors within a radius of several tens of kilometers, and the ground was thrown up to a height of 300 meters. Despite the fact that the explosions themselves were located underground at a depth of more than 100 meters, the result of the scientists was unsatisfactory. A 700-meter channel was formed, 380 meters wide and about 15 meters deep, which can be considered an acceptable result. The direction of the channel turned out to be correct, but not everything worked out with radioactive particles. They flew in all directions, which threatened to violate the nuclear test agreements, and the Taiga project had to be suspended. Subsequently, on the site of the unfinished canal, a small lake was formed, which was called Nuclear. Today they fish there, gather mushrooms, and look for scrap metal left over from the explosion. The radiation background slightly exceeds the norm, but we can say that the residents of nearby areas are lucky. With the development of science, mankind has realized that the climate is an extremely complex and interconnected system, and we do not have enough knowledge to accurately predict how it works. In this regard, the statement of the founders of Microsoft about the desire to spray chalk into the atmosphere to cool the Earth causes some concern. History has already shown that attempts to intervene in the climate may not end well.